What if the fate of nations could shift in the time it takes to sip a cup of tea? Imagine a flight deck trembling with fuel hoses, bombs half-mounted, pilots clutching letters never finished. June 4th, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific, their carriers undefeated, their aviators the most feared in the world. On the flagship Akagi, young officers still believed victory was certain, even as American aircraft were already approaching unseen. In 11 minutes, everything they thought they knew about power, destiny, and invincibility would collapse into fire and smoke. 11 minutes that would turn pride into ash and write a lesson for all humanity, that arrogance is the most fragile weapon of war. This story is not only about planes and ships. It is about choices, sacrifices, and the moment when tradition met innovation. It is about a generation who discovered that war is decided not just by courage, but by systems, by intelligence, and by timing. Today we return to those decisive minutes at Midway, minutes that changed the course of the Pacific, and with it, the future of the world. In the summer of 1942, the Pacific was a Japanese ocean. 6 months earlier, their carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. They had swept across the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. They had sunk battleships, raided harbors, and humbled empires. Every carrier battle so far had been theirs. Their aviators were veterans of countless victories, and their machines, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo planes, were feared across thousands of miles of open water. To the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the mathematics of power seemed undeniable. 4 fleet carriers, more than 240 aircraft, crews drilled with relentless discipline. They believed the Americans were broken, too slow to recover, too clumsy to fight back. On paper, they were right. The United States entered June with 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown. Yorktown had been hit hard at Coral Sea just 1 month earlier. Japanese intelligence estimated she would need 3 months in dry dock. By their standards, that was true. But in Pearl Harbor, 1,400 American workers labored day and night. Welders hammered steel even as the ship sailed. Elevators were repaired while waves broke across her deck. In 72 hours, a carrier that should have been lost was made seaworthy enough to fight. This repair was more than an engineering feat. It was a statement of will. For the Americans, Midway would not be another retreat. Admiral Chester Nimitz had read the enemy's plan in advance. Thanks to the cryptanalysts of Station Hypo who had broken the Japanese JN-25 code, he knew their target, he knew their strength. And so, he placed his carriers not at Pearl, not at Hawaii, but at Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of Midway, waiting. In ambush. The contrast was stark. The Japanese relied on tradition, confidence, and the momentum of victory. The Americans relied on intelligence, improvisation, and determination. One side carried the myth of invincibility. The other carried the quiet weight of the desperate hope. Between them stood the question of who truly understood the future of warfare. As dawn rose on June 4th, the stage was set. The Japanese, masters of the Pacific, sailed forward believing they faced only one crippled American carrier. The Americans, bruised but unbroken, waited for a chance. Neither side could imagine that the destiny of the Pacific and the outcome of the entire conflict would pivot in a window of time shorter than a morning prayer. At 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo launched 7 scout planes to sweep the horizon. Doctrine demanded far more, dozens of eyes fanning out to cover every possible approach. But Nagumo chose to conserve his aircraft for the strike on Midway. Each scout was sent on a narrow line, 300 miles out and back. Vast stretches of ocean remained blind. Worse still, one of the most critical scouts, launched from the cruiser tone, took off half an hour late due to mechanical trouble. That single delay would prove disastrous. By the time the Midway strike force radioed back that a second wave was needed, Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had 93 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attack. His officers urged caution. "Sir, we should keep them ready. We have heard nothing from our scouts, but that does not mean the Americans are not here." Yet pressure mounted. Midway's defenses had not collapsed. Reports of enemy aircraft attacking from the atoll forced Nagumo's hand. At 7:15, he gave the fatal order. Remove the torpedoes, load bombs for land attack. What followed below deck was chaos disguised as order. Torpedoes stacked in hangars because there was no time to return them to magazines. Bombs being mounted while fuel hoses ran across the floor. Ordnance crews working like demons, violating safety rules they had once memorized. The hangar decks became powder kegs, aircraft lined wing to wing, fuel tanks open, ammunition scattered. Above, the flight decks grew crowded with machines waiting for orders that shifted by the minute. At 7:28, the delayed tone scout finally reached its turn point. Looking down, its pilot spotted white wakes on the horizon, an enemy fleet. His first message was vague: 10 ships. Perhaps cruisers, perhaps destroyers. Relief swept the Japanese bridge. No carriers, they believed. The rearming continued. At 7:55, a correction came. The enemy force included a carrier. Panic rippled across the Akagi. Nagumo instantly reversed his order. Suspend rearming, keep torpedoes where they remain, prepare for ship attack. But it was too late. Aircraft were half-armed, half-fueled, scattered between hangar and deck. 2. Launch a coherent strike. All planes needed to carry the same load, aligned for a single mission profile. That would require at least 45 more minutes. And worse, his strike returning from Midway was approaching, low on fuel, demanding recovery. Doctrine was absolute. Recover your planes first, or lose them all. So the Japanese carriers turned into the wind, decks crowded, elevators jammed, aircraft rolling in and out as crews scrambled. Every minute stretched the danger. What had been the most powerful fleet in the world was now paralyzed, its strength trapped in confusion. The carriers were armed neither for land nor for sea. They were armed for disaster. It was at this moment that fate closed its jaws. The delay of one scout, the weight of one decision, the pressure of one doctrine, together they created the window of maximum vulnerability. A window so narrow it might have passed unnoticed. A window that would soon be discovered by desperate American pilots searching the endless blue. At 7 o'clock that morning, Admiral Raymond Spruance faced a choice that would define the battle. His scouts had not yet returned with precise information, and his pilots were still preparing. The safer course was to wait, coordinate the strike, and launch as a single disciplined wave. But Spruance knew time was running out. If the Japanese were recovering aircraft, every minute meant greater danger. His order was short and prophetic. Launch everything. Launch now. Between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, decks of Enterprise and Hornet exploded with activity. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, launched as soon as they were ready, without waiting for others. Squadrons lifted into the sky half-formed, navigating by instinct and rough bearings. To Japanese instructors, this would have been chaos, a breakdown of discipline. To the Americans, it was desperation, and desperation would prove decisive. Among those first to launch were the torpedo squadrons. Outdated TBD devastators groaned into the sky, carrying torpedoes that too often failed to detonate. The men who flew them knew the odds. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Torpedo, Squadron 8 gathered his pilots before takeoff. His words were stark. "We are going alone. We will probably all be killed, but we are going to hit those carriers." They found the enemy by sheer navigation skill. 15 planes, low over the waves, without fighter escort. The Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters descended like hawks. Within minutes, every devastator was shot down. 14 crews perished. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. Floating in the water, hidden beneath a seat cushion, forced to watch what came next. It seemed like futility. Squadron after squadron followed. Torpedo Squadron 6. Torpedo Squadron 3. They too flew straight into the teeth of Zero fighters and flak. More than 35 of 41 torpedo bombers were destroyed that morning, not a single. Torpedoes struck a Japanese carrier, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros had been pulled down to sea level, locked in combat against obsolete planes that bled and burned across the ocean. The carriers, forced to twist and turn to avoid torpedoes, could not launch or recover aircraft. Every Japanese eye was fixed on the waterline, scanning for more attackers. No one was looking up, and above, circling desperately, were American dive bombers running low on fuel, searching the horizon. Their commanders had grown anxious. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise squadrons, made a gamble. Spotting a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, he guessed it was rejoining the main fleet. He turned his planes to follow. That decision, like Spruance's, would change the world. The stage was set. Below, American torpedo pilots had given everything, turning the sky into a graveyard of shattered machines. Above, unescorted dive bombers now approached unnoticed. The 11 minutes that would shatter Japan's naval supremacy were about to begin. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky had been circling for nearly an hour, his fuel gauges sinking toward empty. His pilots were anxious. Some suggested turning back. But then, McClusky spotted something, a single Japanese destroyer racing northeast at full speed, leaving a white scar across the ocean. He guessed it was heading back to the fleet. With no better option, he ordered his squadrons to follow. That hunch would lead them straight to destiny. At 10:22 in the morning, McClusky's 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers finally sighted the enemy. Below them lay the heart of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked across planks. Torpedoes and bombs lay stacked in hangars. Pilots sat in cockpits, engines warming. It was the very picture of vulnerability. McClusky gave the signal. One by one, the Dauntlesses tipped forward, wings folding against the wind, plunging from 14,000 feet. The sky filled with screaming dives. Japanese lookouts only spotted them in the final seconds. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but too late and too low. The Zeros were still far below, chasing torpedo squadrons across the waves. The first bombs struck Kaga. 4 explosions in 30 seconds tore the massive carrier apart. Fire raced down her decks, consuming aircraft stacked wing to wing. Detonations followed as fuel and munitions ignited. Crewmen tried to fight the flames, but were driven back by waves of heat. On Akagi, Lieutenant Richard Best led his squadron. His 1,000-pound bomb punched through the flight deck near the midship elevator and exploded among torpedoes carelessly stacked in the hangar. The blast was catastrophic. Fire roared through compartments, swallowing men alive. Admiral Nagumo stood paralyzed on the bridge as reports poured in. Flight deck destroyed, hangar deck in flames, steering control lost. Soryu was struck almost simultaneously. 3 bombs fell in a perfect line along her flight deck. The first destroyed the forward hangar, the second ignited aircraft midship, the third collapsed the rear elevator. Flames fed on aviation fuel tanks, creating a firestorm hotter than 1,000 degrees. In less than 11 minutes, 3 of the most powerful warships afloat were mortally wounded. Their strength, built over decades of training and victories, had vanished in smoke and steel. Crew leapt into the sea to escape infernos. Officers chose to remain at their posts, some lashing themselves to their bridges in final defiance. Above it all, the dauntless bombers climbed away, their pilots astonished at what they had done. Many were nearly out of fuel, running on fumes, but they had struck at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. Fate had narrowed to an 11-minute window, and the Americans had hit it perfectly. When the bomb blast faded, the Pacific was no longer the same ocean. In that brief span, the myth of Japanese invincibility collapsed. Pride had turned to ash. The tide of the war had shifted, not by months or years of campaigning, but by minutes of fire raining from the sky. Amid the black columns of smoke rising from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, one carrier still floated untouched, Hiryu. Her commander, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was known for his fiery spirit and unyielding courage. Watching his sister ships burn, he did not hesitate. "Prepare to launch," he ordered. With only a fraction of the strength that had once dominated the Pacific, Hiryu would strike back. At 10:58, just 27 minutes after the American attack, Hiryu's first wave rose into the sky. 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. By noon, they had found Yorktown. The American carrier had radar, fighters in the air, and crews ready at their guns. But the Japanese pressed home their attack with veteran precision. 3 bombs tore into Yorktown, setting fires and crippling her boilers. The ship slowed, listing, dead in the water. For a moment, victory seemed possible for Japan. Yamaguchi did not stop. At 1:31 in the afternoon, he launched a second strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. The force was small, but they flew with determination born of desperation. Two torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side. The carrier shuddered, her decks tilting, her power fading. Once again, the Americans faced disaster. Yet the damage control crews, trained, drilled, relentless, fought the fires and stabilized the ship. Yorktown would not go down without a fight. Among the Japanese pilots was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the Midway strike that morning. His plane was already damaged, its fuel tank leaking. He knew he would not have the fuel to return. Yet, he took off anyway, leading his squadron into the teeth of American defenses. His torpedo struck home, but his aircraft crashed into the sea moments later. A sacrifice, like that of so many that day, symbolized the tragic devotion of men who knew their empire's fate hung in the balance. By mid-afternoon, American scouts had located Hiryu. At 5 o'clock, dive bombers from Enterprise and the battered Yorktown descended. 4 bombs tore into Hiryu, igniting fires that roared through her decks. Captain Tomeo Kaku, mortally wounded, gave his final order. "Abandon ship, save yourselves." Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard. His last words to his staff were calm and resolute. "I will apologize to the Emperor. You will rebuild the Navy." He went down with his ship as Hiryu burned into the evening sky. By nightfall, the Kido Butai, the pride of Japan, the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, was gone. 4 carriers, over 2,000 sailors, hundreds of irreplaceable aviators and mechanics. In a single day, the heart of Japanese naval power had been ripped out. The Pacific, once a Japanese ocean, was now contested ground. For the Americans, the cost was heavy. Yorktown crippled, torpedo squadrons annihilated, scores of young men lost. But the balance had shifted. The empire that had seemed unstoppable just months before was now reeling, and the lesson was clear. Courage and sacrifice alone could not sustain a war against a system fueled by intelligence, industry, and relentless adaptation. The Battle of Midway was not just a clash of ships and aircraft. It was a clash of systems. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not simply vessels of steel, they were repositories of experience. Each ship carried hundreds of men whose skills could not be replaced, mechanics who could coax life from overworked engines, armorers who could mount torpedoes in minutes, deck crews who had drilled for years to choreograph the ballet of launch and recovery. In a single day, most were gone. Japan could build new hulls, but it could not rebuild the men who had been lost. A trained pilot required 2 years. A skilled mechanic needed 18 months. A deck crew took half a year of relentless practice. America's factories were already launching carriers at a pace Japan could never match. By the time Japan commissioned 1 new ship, the United States would add 17. By 1943, American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 aviators per month. Japan never exceeded 500. The arithmetic was merciless. The psychological impact was just as profound. For 6 months, the Japanese had believed themselves invincible, their warriors unmatched, their strategy flawless. Midway shattered that illusion in 11 minutes. Survivors spoke of disbelief, of watching steel giants burn to the waterline, of hearing comrades cry out from sealed compartments. The phrase Midway syndrome would later enter Japanese language as a metaphor for overconfidence leading to ruin. Admiral Yamamoto himself, upon hearing the reports, is said to have whispered, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." For the Americans, Midway was a turning point of spirit. Pearl Harbor had left the nation shocked, wounded, humiliated. At Midway, that wound began to heal. The sight of Japanese carriers burning confirmed what few had dared to believe. The enemy could be beaten. Admiral Nimitz told his staff, "They are not supermen. They can be defeated. They have been defeated." From that moment, the United States moved from desperate defense to confident offense. The battle also revealed truths that reshaped modern warfare. Intelligence was as vital as firepower. Decks had to remain clear. Ordnance had to be handled with discipline. Damage control was not mere caution, but survival. Above all, timing and systems triumphed over tradition. The courage of individual pilots mattered, but it was the coordination of intelligence, industry, and command that delivered victory. For those who lived through it, Midway was seared into memory. American dive bomber pilots carried survivors' guilt, haunted by the men they had killed. Japanese sailors bore shame for surviving when their ships died. Both sides learned that war was not glory, but sacrifice, not certainty, but chance. In the grand arc of World War II, Midway stands as the fulcrum. The Pacific shifted from Japanese expansion to American counterattack. The empire that had dreamed of ruling the ocean was forced onto defense, and the nation that had doubted itself discovered the strength to endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail. In the span of 11 minutes, the tide of the Pacific War turned. 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, lay in ruins. By nightfall, a 4th had joined them. What had seemed like an unstoppable advance collapsed into a desperate defense. Midway was more than a battle. It was a reminder that arrogance is brittle, and that history often pivots on moments smaller than a heartbeat. For the United States, the victory was not only measured in ships and aircraft, but in spirit. The same nation stunned at Pearl Harbor now stood tall, proving that sacrifice and determination could prevail against fear. The men who flew obsolete torpedo planes and never returned, the dive bomber crews who struck at the perfect instant, the welders who restored Yorktown in 72 hours, they embodied a truth that outlasts combat. Wars are won by systems, by unity, by faith in something greater than pride. The legacy of Midway still speaks to us. In World War II, 11 minutes redefined the balance of power in the Pacific. For families who carried the weight of World War II, the memory of those who never came home is a solemn call to value peace. And for us who inherited the lessons of World War II, the meaning is clear. Freedom must be defended, not with arrogance, but with vigilance, courage, and compassion. So, what legacy will we leave? Will we remain silent and divided, or will we choose to stand together, to eliminate fascism, to fight for peace, to fight for justice, to fight for freedom? If this story moves something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe. Because history is not just the past, it is the inheritance we carry forward, and the voices of Midway remind us still. In moments of peril, the strength of unity can change the world.